You good to go?
Yeah, whenever you are.
All right, everyone, welcome to Data Matters. It's our I don't want to say it's our weekly or monthly, our occasional series of talks on things where data matters. And I think it's we try to bring people from all over campus and beyond to talk about places where data is used. And I think this is a perfect example, and I'm really looking forward to talk. Peter Hull here from the Department of Economics, also a faculty fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research, is doing a lot of work. And so Peter works in econometrics, which is, I guess, data science for economics.
I think that's fair.
It's a really interesting area of economics that really speaks a lot about how we make inferences from data, how we sort of figure out what interventions we should do. And I think we'll talk a lot about that here today in these two areas. So thank you for coming.
Yeah, well, thanks very much for having me. It's good to see everybody. Thanks for coming today. So I understand I have around 30 or 35 minutes maybe to tell you about some work I've done where data matters. And so I want to basically use this time to give a kind of high level overview of a couple of research projects that I've worked on that I've been very interested in, and projects where I've really learned something kind of deep from, which is not always the case with research. Sometimes you go in and you're like, okay, I sort of know how this is going to go, and it goes the way you'd expect. But these are papers where, I personally really learned something, and I think it's useful to sort of talk through them in kind of that narrative sense. So I'm calling this sort of summary Discrimination in High Stakes Settings, lesson from bail and foster care. The starting point is pretty straightforward. It's very easy to motivate studies of discrimination. The starting point goes like this. We know that there are racial or other forms of disparities in many important settings, from sort of criminal justice to healthcare, lending, employment, many other settings as well. And so if you look across all these settings, without fail, you will find significant differences in some form of treatment, high stakes treatment or outcomes by race or by gender or by other protected characteristics. And when we do this, when we document these disparities in the data, very understandably, they raise concerns about discrimination or bias, unequal treatment, which may or may not be illegal in different contexts. But, we know that inferring discrimination, concluding that there is some discrimination upon seeing some disparities, is not so straightforward. There's a number of reasons why, but the one that I'm going to focus on today is what we call in economics omitted variable bias, or OVB. Consider, a criminal justice setting where we're looking at traffic stops, and we see that, say, Black or Hispanic drivers are more likely to be pulled over than white drivers. We might wonder if that's due to discrimination. Something about the race of the driver itself is causing the officers to pull people over at higher rates. But it could be because of factors that we don't see in the data. It could be because individuals of some race, I'm not saying this is a fact, this is a possibility. It could be that individuals of some race are more likely to be carrying contraband or otherwise acting, illegally in a way that, kind of justifies more intervention under the law. So that's an example of a very simple setting where we have a high stakes, decision. We have very clear racial disparities in the data, but we have these background factors, omitted variables that may or may not explain those disparities in contrast to discrimination. And of course, if we observed someone's contraband carrying status, we could potentially, probe this directly, but in most settings, we don't observe those omitted variables. And so we can't just sort of naively adjust for it when computing the disparities. So this is a very common problem in discrimination analysis, empirical discrimination analysis in all of these different settings. And so today I want to talk about two papers that I've worked on that try to make some progress on this issue by leveraging a combination of unique data, right? So data matters. I'm going to talk about the administrative data that we use to address this in these two settings, but also sort of a novel form, at least novel in this world, form of variation in the data. What we talk about in econ is quasi-experimental variation, or as if random variation, which is going to allow us to sort of address this omitted variable bias at least somewhat. And so these two papers are listed here. One of them is in the bail context. One of them is in the foster care context. One is a couple years old at this point. The other one was published this year. All right, so to set things up, let me just sort of summarize the context. And I should say, I am used to presenting in front of economists who have no problem at all interrupting at any point. So if you feel like something is unclear or you want to ask a question, please do just raise your hand. I'm happy to take it in real time.
I mean, you got to slide through.
I know, I'm amazed. This is why I was like, something must be wrong. Like, am I speaking English? No, but please do let me know, especially if it's just like a clarifying point. I'm happy to say. So let me set things up by just talking about the setting of this first paper. So it's pretrial bail. And it's a setting which is kind of similar to the traffic stop setting that I motivated on the previous slide. It's a setting in which we have a high stakes decision that's being made by law enforcement, in this case, a pretrial bail judge. Bail judges make a lot of decisions, but sort of the main decision they make when an individual is sort of brought before them, these are individuals who are sort of charged with a crime, but haven't yet seen trial or been convicted. The judge decides whether to sort of let them go or detain them, usually with some sort of monetary bail conditions. And typically what happens is the judge sets some amount that the defendant has to pay in order to be released from jail. And in most settings, including the one that I'm going to talk about, which is New York City, those sort of monetary conditions are binding. People can't pay it, and so they are detained. And so you could think of this as basically a binary decision, whether to release the defendant or detain them by setting some sort of bail conditions. Of course, the reality is a bit more complicated than that. But in the interest of giving a high-level summary, that's how I want you to think about this today. So that's kind of like the traffic stop versus not, like that kind of binary decision. Obviously, maybe not obviously, but this is very high stakes for defendants. There's been some previous research, including by my co-authors, showing that when you are denied release, when you are detained before trial, you see large increases in non-employment rates. You tend to lose your job. You also tend to be more likely to be convicted. Don't quite know the causal channel there. But in any event, these are very important decisions.
See, one causal channel is that if you're detained before trial, you don't have access to the legal services. It's much harder to get services.
Great point. Yeah.
You lose your job, you have no money.
That's exactly what it is. That's very, yeah, thank you. Okay, so that's sort of the setting in a nutshell. What's nice about this setting for our analysis, kind of like the traffic stop example I gave before, but even more so here, is that there's a very clear objective of bail judges when they're deciding whether or not to release people for trial. Their objective under the law, their mandate, is to detain those that have some potential for what's called pretrial misconduct. And that's sort of an umbrella term for either a failure to appear, so we release you before trial and then you skip town, you don't come back, or you commit new crime when you're released. So judges are sort of mandated to try and figure out who has potential for pretrial misconduct and who doesn't, and to detain those that have potential and release those that don't. Now, obviously, that's a very hard task, right? That's a hard thing to predict for anyone. But that is, at least under the law, how they are supposed to be thinking about that decision. And that yields for us a very natural measure of discrimination, which I think, there's lots of ways to define discrimination, as Suresh knows. There's lots of different sort of fairness considerations. This is one that actually has some precedence in the computer science literature as well. Sort of equalized odds is the idea here. But the idea that we came up with was to compare the pretrial release rates for white and black defendants who have identical misconduct potential. So we want to compare two people who, if released before trial, would have sort of the identical potential for failing to appear or committing a new crime. But one is black and one is white, and see whether the black defendant is detained at a higher rate. So that's the measure that we came up with. It sort of comes out of this setting, and the reason why it's a very tractable measure here is that we can't just immediately measure it, but we have some scope for measuring it because we observe misconduct potential at least selectively. We observe the misconduct potential of people who are actually released before trial because we see their outcomes. We see whether they skipped trial or committed new crimes. Of course, the challenge is that we don't see that for everybody. If you are detained before trial, we don't get to see that potential outcomes. That's a selection problem. That kind of selection problem is one that econ has worked on for 30 or 40 years now. It comes up in a lot of settings that we're interested in. But the insight here is that we can use some of the tools that econ has sort of been working on for solving that challenge in this new setting to estimate that measure of discrimination. And the way in particular we're going to do that is by using the quasi-random, as good as random assignment of bail judges with varying release rates. And that's going to be our source of variation for solving this problem. And I'll try and sketch the intuition for that. Okay, so here's the intuition. It turns out that in order to estimate this measure of discrimination, we don't actually need to know the misconduct potential of every single person in the data. We just need to know the distribution of pretrial misconduct potential by race. If we know sort of the base rates, like the base probability of pretrial misconduct for white defendants and black defendants, then it turns out, and I'm sort of skipping the math here, but hopefully this is at least partly intuitive, it turns out that we can use that distributional knowledge to adjust the release rate disparities that we see in the data to appropriately sort of control for pretrial misconduct potential. Now, we can easily estimate selected distribution. So among the defendants who are released, we get to see the rates of pretrial misconduct for white defendants and black defendants. And we see that again just from the defendants that a judge chooses to release, but we don't see that for everyone. And so the intuition for how we get around that, let me start by sort of outlining a kind of crazy example. Suppose that we saw in the data a judge who we can call supremely lenient, who releases everybody that's assigned to them. And let's also suppose that judge assignment is totally random. Now, neither of those things are true, but just bear with me for a second. If this were true, if we could identify a supremely lenient judge who is randomly assigned, then we could look at the distribution of pretrial misconduct potential by race among the defendants assigned to that judge, and that would tell us the unselected distribution of pretrial misconduct potential. Why? Because the judge sees just a totally random sample of people, and then they release everybody. So it's like we ran an experiment where we went in and just like grabbed a random group of people and released them, saw their pretrial misconduct potential, and then per this first bullet, we can use that to identify our discrimination measure. Please, yeah.
Misconduct happened, because of course, if you're, they show up or not, right, that's one. But of course, once you get into like whether or not they can the time,
Absolutely. So we're not saying any, we're not able to do anything about differential policing in this paper. It's future crime as measured in the rearrest data. And so that is a problem potentially. It's a problem that we think works against the findings, which I'm going to tell you about, because I think our natural models are that, policing is harsher on black defendants than white defendants. And so that I'll sort of hopefully try and get to how that might bias us against the findings that we find, but that's a good consideration. Yeah. Okay, so back to this example. If we had this sort of supremely lenient judge who's randomly assigned, we'd be done. We'd look at the outcomes, setting aside that very good concern, look at the outcomes of the defendants assigned to that supremely lenient judge, learn the distribution of misconduct potential, learn those base rates, adjust for them, get our measure of discrimination. So the intuition here is that, even though in practice we don't have any supremely lenient judges, and even though judges are not totally randomly assigned, we do have variation in judge release rates. Some judges release a lot of people, some judges release very few. And we have evidence both from our knowledge of how the system works and the data that we see that judges are quasi-randomly assigned, in the sense that within courtroom and time periods, which judge you get assigned to is as good as random. It kind of depends on the exact time that your case gets processed. And so we have some quasi-random assignment of varying leniency judges. And the insight is that we can use that variation to extrapolate the misconduct distributions of released defendants across these differently as good as randomly assigned judges, trying to target the judges with the higher release rates to learn this hypothetical supremely lenient judge distribution. And so I have a picture to illustrate this. There's a lot going on in this picture, but I'll try and give you a high level summary. So basically, each dot on this picture is a judge by defendant race cell. Blue dots are white defendants, orange crosses are black defendants, and then each point is a judge. On the x-axis is the judge's release rate after adjusting for courtroom and time. So the variation across this is kind of as good as random variation if you were assigned to different judges. And then on the y-axis is the pretrial misconduct rate of defendants released by that judge. So a couple things you can see here. First of all, as you move towards judges with higher release rates, the pretrial misconduct rate increases. That's sort of sensible. That says that judges are actually trying to target and succeeding at least partly in targeting this pretrial misconduct rate. As they release more people, the outcome rate rises. So they're sort of detaining the riskiest people first. That's what that sort of says. Now, if we had a supremely lenient judge, if we had a judge who released everyone, they of course would have a release rate of 1, and we would just read off on the intercept the pretrial misconduct rates, and that would be all we need to estimate discrimination. Yeah.
I just want to make sure I'm seeing this right. Each judge would then have 2 dots on this.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah. So we need the black mean risk. We need the white mean risk. If we had dots at 1, we could just read them off. We don't have dots at 1. Thankfully, judges don't just release everybody. That would be probably not the best. But we do have some judges who release, 90%, 85%. There's noise here, of course, because these are samples. These aren't, the population. And so the idea is to sort of learn the distribution of pretrial misconduct among released defendants with respect to release rate and extrapolate out to the points that we don't observe. And we could do that extrapolation in different ways. I like linear regression, so you can just fit a line. You could do something fancier, like a non-parametric, like local linear regression or some kernel-weighted thing or something. You could also do bounds. So if you didn't want to claim that you can point identify the means here at 1, you could say that you have information that lets you bound those mean risk points, and that you can make progress with that. But that's the basic idea. And I should have said by now, this is New York City. So that's the setting of this paper. And this is the sort of analysis that we conduct to get around that selection problem. You can see how the black distribution of risk is sort of everywhere higher than the white distribution of risk. And so that kind of shows you the omitted variable bias that I was talking about before. At least some of the disparities that we see, and we do see that black individuals are more likely to be detained than white individuals. This is telling us that at least some of that disparity is due to differences in pretrial misconduct potential. And so when we adjust for that, that disparity is going to shrink. And now we can use the sort of intercepts here to figure out exactly how much to shrink that disparity. Okay, so what do we find? So as I was saying, we find that white defendants are about 10% more likely to be released before trial than black defendants. But in line with what I was just saying, this disparity partly reflects OVB because black defendants are riskier. If we use our various estimates of those intercepts to adjust this overall disparity, we find that about 2/3 of it is not explained by differences in misconduct potential. So about 1/3 of it is, about 2/3 of it isn't. And if you want to label that discrimination, as we do in the paper, that sort of tells us how high that discrimination measure is. White defendants are 5 percentage points more likely to be released before trial than black defendants with identical pretrial misconduct potential. And then we do a bunch of other stuff in the paper, just sort of putting it here if you're interested. We can look at heterogeneity. So this is kind of the overall discrimination in the system, but we can look at this at judge by judge, and we can sort of say what drivers there might be by the characteristics of judges, which explain higher and lower discrimination. We also do a bunch of robustness checks, varying the definition of pretrial misconduct, which partly gets at your question, actually, because we can do this just looking at failure to appear, and we get very similar results. We also look at, different types of release decisions and how we do that extrapolation. Yeah.
Thinking of your additional analysis, do you have among the characteristics of the judges race?
Unfortunately not, no. We have just numeric anonymous identifiers for the judge. So we can learn things that we see in the data like experience. I guess we have age, although I forget exactly how we get that. But we have limited demographic information of the judges. For the study I'm about to tell you about, the next one, we are able to do that kind of analysis though. Yeah.
There could be, of course, effects at play. Rusty on the list on a lot of this conversation, but job or what they have
As driving the differences in pretrial misconduct potential, you mean? Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah. So this is where I promised to give you a verbal kind of defense of why this would bias us against that finding. And I can try and do that on the fly. I think the stories that you're telling, as well as the stories about the arrest, would predict that black defendants have a higher misconduct potential, right? And I think that that would go the other way, right? It would mean that we would find lower discrimination. So yeah. Okay, so that's this first, yeah, please.
Where this data comes from, like, if especially with not having the judges there, since it's in theory, like, this is public record, right? But
In theory.
this is so-
No, it's not. Yeah, so we got this
records.
by working with the New York City Department of Corrections, and they were willing to give us most of the information, but they were not willing to give us information that would let us identify individual judges. I think they didn't want us writing in the New York Times like, hey, this particular judge is really racist, which understandable maybe. Okay, so let me just quickly talk about something which is probably familiar to a lot of you, you know, who at least those who are coming from sort of the computer science literature. You know, one thing that kind of came out of this analysis for me is that we were really working with a kind of fundamentally different notion of discrimination, which is typically used in economics. So in economics, classic economic theory, if you're familiar with this world at all, you're familiar with sort of the two types of discrimination that we talk about a lot. We talk about taste-based discrimination and statistical discrimination, and I won't get into the details of that, but basically taste-based is sort of driven by true bias or prejudice, and statistical is driven by people sort of accurately predicting outcomes differently by race and acting according to that. And if you're in economics, these are the two types that you'll just hear again and again and again and again. If you write any sort of discrimination paper, your referees will always be like, oh, well, is it taste-based or is it statistical? It's really ingrained in our training that this is like the only two types of discrimination out there. And in the paper, because we're writing an economics paper, we had to address this. So we found some evidence of both of these in New York City bail decisions. But the thing that came out for me, again, maybe not so surprising to some of you, is that this discrimination measure that we sort of thought was reasonable in this setting doesn't started to call kind of indirect or systemic discrimination. And this comes out, whoops, I don't know what that is. This comes out, of course, in the computer science literature, because if you think about algorithms that don't use race directly, they still might discriminate in a sense of the way that we analyze here. And it's not because of taste-based or statistical discrimination. It's because of the non-race characteristics embedding some sort of past discrimination or disparities and sort of perpetuating that through the algorithm.
Why isn't that statistical discrimination?
In statistical discrimination in classic econ, we imagine it's on the basis of the observed race. So in econ, there's no notion of sort of race blindness in econ because we think that people always perceive race. And so the classic economic theories always operate at least somewhat directly through race. There's no sort of race blind algorithm, at least until recently. So that's something that computer science has really raised our awareness on. In any event, we sort of were surprised by this because we are economists. These days, we're not surprised by it so much. But that kind of, I want to point that out just because this, in the narrative form of this paper, this is a story of how I sort of learned something from, I wasn't expecting from going into the data and thinking hard about the analysis we were doing here. And we've since sort of tried to formalize this in some follow-up work. Let me now, I'm going slower than I thought, which is good because you guys are asking good questions. But let me now turn to the other paper, which studies a different setting. This studies child protection. And so let me give you, again, a high-level overview of child protection. So CPS, much like bail judges, have a sort of clear mandate. Their mandate is to investigate reports of child maltreatment, whether abuse or neglect. And if they deem the risk of future abuse or neglect to be high, they will temporarily place children in foster care. That is, they will remove them from home. Now, I probably don't have to tell you that this is a high stakes decision. Of course, this is a very consequential decision with a long history of, you know, racism, frankly, in the United States. And, you know, there's been a lot of work in economics as well as outside of it, looking at the effects of foster care placement on various outcomes of children and family. In practice, and this I didn't know when I started this is just like a data fact, which blew my mind when I first started working on this. Contact with child protection is very common and it's very unequal. So 5% of white kids at some point before the time they turn 18 will spend some time in foster care in the United States. 10%, 1 in 10 Black kids will spend some time in foster care by the age of 18. So first of all, those numbers are really high for both races, but second of all, it's twice as high for Black children. And so just like with the traffic stops, just like with the pretrial misconduct, this naturally makes us wonder about discrimination, particularly because of the long history of, racial separation of families in the United States. But just like in those settings, it may not be discrimination, it may be omitted variables. And here, when we started working on this, when we started thinking about this, we were like, aha, there's a pretty clear mapping of the framework that we worked on in Bail to this setting, such that we could sort of port over those statistical tools that we developed into this new setting. So pretrial release is our sort of treatment in the econ, causal inference language. Foster care placement is the corresponding treatment. Pretrial misconduct potential is the potential outcome, the outcome in the bail setting. Future maltreatment potential is the outcome in the foster care setting.
Technically, isn't pretrial non-released version of?
Yes, so things are one minus D.
But
Yeah. But the conceptual point is the conceptual mapping is there. But that's exactly right. And you're anticipating what I'm gonna sort of talk about next. We get to, just like in the bail context where we see pretrial misconduct potential among the released, we get to see future maltreatment potential among the kids who are not removed from home because we get to see what would happen to them, but there's a selection problem there. In the child protection setting, it turns out that there is also the same kind of variation that we used in the bail context. Caseworkers in child protection are quasi-randomly assigned, again, conditional on some stuff, depending on the exact timing of when your case get referred, you may be assigned to one caseworker or another. But there's a new twist here, a new twist which really interested us when we started working on this, which is that there's not just one decision, as it turns out, for CPS. There's actually at least two decisions that are sort of made in two phases. And here's how it looks actually in CPS. These are numbers from the CPS system of Michigan, which is where we got the data here. So how CPS actually works is basically cases are referred through a hotline. So people can call in, either mandated reporters like teachers or police officers or healthcare workers, or just like neighbors and family friends can call this hotline and say, hey, I think this child is being abused or neglected. Those calls get routed to call screeners. The call screeners then decide whether the case is worth pursuing or not. In Michigan, about 40% of cases are so-called screened out, so they're not continued on past that phase. The remaining 60% get assigned to an investigator who then does a deep dive, maybe a month-long investigation, interviewing, collecting, various forms of data to try and determine the risk of future maltreatment in the home. Then the investigator sort of makes the final decision of whether to place the child in foster care or not. Here in Michigan, the rates of foster care have come way down nationally, but particularly in Michigan, only 3% of cases that reach that phase actually result in foster care placement. 97% of kids are then left in the home. So what's interesting about this to us, of course, is that, there might be discrimination at both phases of the system. They might interact. So the initial discrimination by call screeners can be amplified or mitigated or diminished, even offset completely by investigators. So thinking about that, analyzing those interactions in a sort of system was really interesting to us. Of course, it's also important for policy targeting. And then, as I said, sort of luckily we can get at this because we have quasi-random assignment, actually not just of investigators, but also of screeners. So we can sort of apply our approach from the previous paper to both phases of the system and then try and connect them in a particular way. And the nice thing here, relative to the bail context is that, again, we do have a selection challenge. We don't see the future maltreatment of everybody, but we see it for almost everybody, 97%. So there's a selection problem, but it's a pretty small selection problem. And that means we have more precision, more scope to do various kinds of analyses, including the one you mentioned of looking at disparities by investigator and screener race, which we do have in this data. Yeah.
Whether the initial call coming in is actually the first call pertaining to a child, or if it's like they've already been through this investigation, they were screened out, and then
we can link kids over time, and we have roughly 10 years of data, I think, here. And so in the first year, we can't tell if someone had been sort of through the system already, but by like halfway through the data, if we don't see them before then we know it's their first time. And we did look at that heterogeneity too, of like whether you're a repeat kid or not.
I mean, some of the algorithms that are used, the screeners actually take that data into account.
They do.
They look at number
Yeah.
of times, number of instances of previous contact with the CPS in the last 5 years or whatever.
Yep.
This will track that data as well.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's right. Okay, so rather than showing, we have the graph, like the graph I showed you, we do basically the same thing. Let me just sketch the findings because I want to, make sure we're not using too much of the time here. So the main findings here are, much like in the bail context, there's a clear racial disparity. So cases involving Black kids are about 50% more likely to result in foster care placement versus those involving white kids. And we see those disparities at both the screening phase and the investigation phase. If we adjust for differences in future maltreatment potential using the same techniques as I showed you before, something kind of interesting happens. This actually increases the foster care placement disparity to 65%. And the reason for that is that it turns out, unlike in the bail context here, Black kids turn out to have a lower risk of future maltreatment than white kids. And so that means that the omitted variable bias goes the other direction in this setting, such that when we adjust for future maltreatment potential, the disparity is even larger. And we have some theories for why that might be. I mean, there's selection into this system. So the cases that get referred in are, of course, a selected sample, and we're not able to deal with that selection because we don't have a good strategy for that. So it could just be a feature of that. But in any event, what we can say is that in the data, this is the sort of direction of OVB. And then the sort of more, what we were more expecting to find here is that there is discrimination at both phases of the system. So if we do this analysis at the screening phase and at the investigation phase, and then we decompose the sort of overall, let's call it unwarranted disparity in terms of screening and investigation, we find that about 13 or 19% of the total is due to that initial phase, and that subsequent investigation amplifies that quite considerably. And here we do find that this is driven by white investigators and white screeners. In fact, for Black investigators, the disparity goes the other way. So Black investigators tend to remove white kids from home at a higher rate than Black kids. And here it seems to be driven more by taste-based discrimination than by indirect or statistical. Yeah. Thanks.
So when talking about future maltreatment, there's an indication there that there was some maltreatment and that
No, you're asking great questions. You're asking exactly the right questions that the referees also asked us a lot about. So I'm skipping over some. Maybe you were. I'm skipping over some. No, this is a good point, and I should have actually included it in the slides. So we don't observe true maltreatment. We observe re-investigation and re-referral, and we're using that as a proxy for, and much like rearrest in the bail context, subject to the same problems that rearrest is, of course. And so we could talk about, I'm happy to talk about afterwards, but there's a number of checks we do for different proxies, sort of earlier versus later in the stage, including future removal as an outcome, although that's a rare outcome, so it's a little noisy. So things are very robust, but that is a limitation. Yeah. No.
Yeah, in part because, it's a really good, I think it's a good clarification, but also because the next bullet around Black kids when you have a lower risk of future maltreatment, could indicate, I'm sure you're about that, but could indicate less accuracy of the calls.
Right.
I guess, right?
Yes. So that is kind of what I was trying to get at with the maybe selection into this being different by race. So what Black kids just are more likely to be referred for minor stuff. And we can't say anything about that because we don't have any data before the calls come in. I think the way that we're thinking about this is if we were to take this system as given, not able to intervene before, what interventions could we do here? And there we sort of take that as given, but yeah, I think that's probably what's going on. Yeah.
So it could have levels, right? As in physical abuse
Mhm.
or verbal abuse.
Yep. So we can break things out separately by those, and it's very consistent across the different types of maltreatment.
regarding the like, selection thing that you just mentioned, or do you find any heterogeneity by the neighborhood that they live in? So
That's a great question. We were expecting to, because there's a big conversation in this literature about race and the intersection of, I'm sorry, class and the intersection of class and race. But kind of surprisingly, if we look at heterogeneity by neighborhood income, we don't find much. So it seems to be driven by race itself, and that sort of relates to this point about it being driven by taste-based discrimination. But we were surprised by that. Okay, so that's this paper in a nutshell. Here, there's another surprising finding, which we weren't kind of expecting, which we frankly grappled with a bit how to write up. Most, I've sort of hinted at this already, but most discussions about disparities in CPS are focusing on the possibility of overplacement of Black kids into foster care. So Black families being burdened by unnecessary family separation. And that was frankly what we were expecting to find. However, we found some kind of interesting heterogeneity here. I've sort of glossed over this, but we can look at sort of not only overall discrimination, overall unwarranted disparity. Remember what that is differences in foster care placement rates conditional on future maltreatment potential. We can look at that overall, but we can also look at that separately by whether future maltreatment potential is 1 or 0. So whether you are at high risk or low risk of future maltreatment potential. And what we found is that the discrimination here is concentrated in cases with potential for future maltreatment, not cases without. And we know from other work in this literature that intervention in those cases very naturally is likely to be beneficial for both Black kids and white kids. Of course, you're removing them from an abusive or neglectful home. And so if you sort of follow the threads here, what that suggests is actually a sort of underplacement of white children. Black kids are being removed from home at a higher rate than white kids, but in environments where you really should be removing kids from home. And that kind of goes against the sort of, classic kind of discussion here about overplacement of Black kids. And what we think is going on here, related to the point I was saying before about heterogeneity, it seems like families are sort of giving the benefit of the doubt to, investigators are giving the benefit of the doubt to families that share their race. So white investigators are giving disproportional leniency to white parents, which ends up leading to worse outcomes for their children. That seems to be what's going on in this context. But again, this was something we were very surprised to find, and it was kind of hard to write up because it very much goes against this fear of overplacement. And I think the thing highlight here in terms of data mattering is that, we weren't able to do this before to really look at these disparities conditional on this potential outcome. Once we were able to do that, we were able to sort of tell this story. Okay, I think I'm basically out of time. So let me just flag very quickly 2 other studies that are sort of more in progress that give you a sense of where we're going with this line of work. One is in the foster care setting where we're sort of broadening things from Michigan to a sort of nationwide analysis looking at heterogeneity across different states. This turns out to require a new kind of twist in the methods because we don't have the investigators and screener identities in this new national data set. So we have to do some bounding exercise without that quasi-experimental variation. But we find some interesting patterns here, which I'm happy to talk about after the talk. The other one, which might be of interest to the CS folks in the crowd, is thinking about algorithmic discrimination. So we have an extension of the Bail analysis to study discrimination in what's called pretrial risk scores. As Suresh was sort of indicating in the child protection setting, there's increasingly use of these algorithms that are trying to predict, in this case, misconduct potential using defendant characteristics as a guide to judge decision-making. And we can use exactly the same kind of extrapolation techniques to measure discrimination in those algorithmic scores, just as in human decision makers. And we can fix the scores to remove it. And so we have an analysis that sort of shows how to correct these existing risk scores to remove these kind of unwarranted disparities, as well as to improve their accuracy, because these risk scores are typically estimated on selected samples, on the samples of defendants who are released. And so we can use our technology not only to remove just algorithmic discrimination, but to actually make them more accurate. And we find significant scope for doing that in New York City. So I think I'm basically out of time, and I want to make sure we have enough time to chat with Suresh. So let me just wrap up by saying, obviously, we've made some progress here, but we haven't solved it. The measuring discrimination in high stake settings is fundamentally pretty hard. The way that we've made progress is by focusing on very particular decisions where we understand the objectives, and that gives us a sort of natural measure of discrimination. And then we pair that with rich administrative data and quasi-random assignment to deal with that selection challenge. We think that we have some new insights out of this, again, some of which I wasn't expecting, but suffice to say there's a lot more to do. So not only are there likely many other settings with this kind of intellectual arbitrage opportunity, and if folks here have ideas for some, please, I'm all ears. I'd love to have a third chapter to this slide deck in a couple of years. But I think, you know, new tools will probably be needed to address particular features of those settings just as they were in these two. So let me stop there. Thanks so much for your time. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
So one of the things we like to do at these seminars is,
I have to turn this
Yeah.
off. There we
one
go.
of the things we like to do is have, a sort of a more casual, less presentation, more discussion. So, I'll just bring some chairs up front, Peter, just
Yeah.
grab a seat. You want to get some water?
Yeah,
And then we
water's
just
good.
chat. Well, I have some questions for you to start off with, but I think we'd love to hear from the audience as well, over and above what we already talk about. So I have a couple of things for you, and I think some of this is methodological as well, because as you indicated, right, there's a whole parallel track to the work you're doing in the CS side of things that I'm very familiar with, and I see echoes of that here. Maybe the first question I have is a very low level question, but it's a specific question. You mentioned algorithm discrimination and this issue of disparities conditional on potential outcomes. I hear you say that, and I think, okay, that's what equalized odds does. Right? So is that what you're saying basically?
Basically, yeah, basically, yeah. So we link that to equalized odds. I think the new insight we're trying to bring to this, and it's not actually a new insight because there is this work on kind of selective labels problem or whatever in CS. The new insight is that we can use econometric tools for dealing with selection to address the fact that equalized odds in many settings is not something we can directly estimate in real world high stake settings because we can't experiment to observe those potential outcomes.
I see. So the insight here is that for the CS formulation of the problem, for do equalized odds calculations, you need to have the ground truth label,
Exactly.
which you don't have.
Exactly.
And what you're saying is, okay, there's a way to get around
If
that.
you're
And that's the way to
designing-
think about that.
If you're designing the algorithm, if you have the ability to release and detain defendants, at will, then you can learn these potential outcomes and therefore learn equalized odds as you're designing this algorithm. But if we're taking the data as given, we're not able to go in and randomly release some defendants before trial. We need to work with a sort of existing variation, which is the
Which is that I find a lot of the sort of the innovation in econometrics comes from trying to identify sort of natural cut points where you can do these things.
Yeah, exactly. It's very much in line with the sort of credibility revolution in heavy quotes in economics, which kind of looks for these natural experiments and sort of random variation that exists, maybe conditional on some stuff and using that in a sort of new way.
So I have two more questions and I'll open it up to the audience. The second question is, you alluded briefly to this issue of what I'll call the limitation of a fixed frame, right? So as you said, we're taking the system as given to us and seeing where we can intervene, but we acknowledge that there are plenty of places around it where maybe an intervention would have been more effective, but that's kind of out of our scope of analysis right now. Which I get, for the purpose of analysis, you have to do that.
Yeah.
But I think this is something that I think in every discipline we struggle with, right? This issue of you fix a frame and now you're limited to the frame. How do you get sometimes the right, like for example, in New Jersey, when they were doing their pretrial algorithm, what they did was they kind of flipped the script where they said, we're going to release you unless there's a really strong reason not. And that had a very different effect on the outcome. It was a very different design process that they did.
Yeah.
And then in another place, I think they did an experiment where it's like, okay, we're not going to worry about assessing risk of failure to appear. We're just going to make sure everyone gets a text message when it's time for them to show up in court. Right? If the goal is to get people to show up in court, then that's what you should focus on rather than trying to measure whether someone is not going to appear. Now, this is again outside the frame of reference, but it's also a valid way to intervene in the bigger problem. I struggle with this in the world I live in. I'm just wondering, how do you approach these kinds of frame fixing issues in your work?
I think econ is often maybe correctly accused of being a little too incrementalist in its approach. It's sort of like, let's take the data, take the system as it is, and then study this like very narrow one particular thing, this one particular policy. And I think that things have broadened in recent years. People are running more creative experiments like the ones you mentioned, or sort of bigger questions where they flip the script a little bit more. But I think it, you know, I approach it as sort of the point of these papers was to develop tools, and those tools can potentially be used in various ways. Hopefully ways that can let us broaden our frame. So like, for example, when we were working on the Bail paper, we got a lot of questions about like, well, what about discrimination by police and who actually shows up in front of the judge?
Right.
You know, you're kind of conditioning on that, like what is how do you get around that? And we took that very seriously, but we couldn't say anything in that setting because we didn't have that variation. So when we found the foster care setting, we were able to at least like peel one layer of that onion off and be like, okay, if you happen to have enough variation to look at two phases in a system, here is how you can use that to disentangle this and look at the system as a whole. Of course, we still had a limit of not being able to go before the call screeners, but we were sort of pointing in the direction methodologically for how you would do that. So I think that's kind of how I see my role here. You know, I'm not skilled in running creative experiments of sending text messages to defendants and things like that, but maybe I can like, you know, suggest some tools for broadening things a little bit, and then hopefully in the next iteration we can keep broadening.
I'll have one last question. This is again a methodology question. I think you have notes on econometrics. Yeah, I think I've in my one of my many folders of things I need to read at some point, I've saved your notes on econometrics. So like,
Yeah.
I need to learn more about econometrics. So I
yeah.
feel like there's a whole methodological sort of component there that I'm missing in my own work.
I have all my teaching slides from my grad at Applied Economics.
Yeah. So
on my website.
I guess, you know, you're a DSI talking to folks interested in data science. How should I understand what I can get and what I should be able to learn from taking an econometrics class? I mean, what do I get out of it?
So econometrics is many different things, but in recent years, econometrics is very much focused on causal inference, and particularly causal inference from observational data. So, you know, the tools that we focus on in an applied econometrics class that focus on causal inference are things like difference and differences, regression discontinuity, instrumental variables, you know, using models to go beyond kind of experiments and local variation. I think that's, if you're interested in that sort of thing, you know, that's something that economists have really been thinking hard about. I know we're not the only ones, but it's something we've been really thinking hard about for the last 30 or 40 years. And there's been a lot of very exciting progress, you know, again, not just from economics, but I think, you know, in applied econometrics in the last 10 or 15 years, there's been a lot of very interesting work, particularly because we have broadened the scope of applications a little bit more. I mean, things like foster care or, you know, bail, those weren't really in the domain of econ 20 years ago. And I think by looking at these different settings, you don't have to be an economist to be interested in foster care, but you can see how these methods are kind of used and then think about, oh, like I'm interested in some other thing, maybe I can use those methods in that setting. So I think causal inference is really the bread and butter of econometrics these days. Of course, there's a lot of other things there too, but that's the stuff that I get.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
In your, you know, the picture that I asked about before, the one with the
Dots.
one judge.
Yeah.
Is a pair of dots.
Yeah.
Did you do anything, I mean, that would imply that you can draw a line, that for each judge, you can draw a line from one of their.
You can connect the black and the white for a given judge. Yeah.
Did you do any kind of analysis of along those lines? Some of this,
In the extended sort of model where we were trying to understand the drivers of discrimination in terms of taste-based, statistical, or indirect, that model uses the sort of within judge correlation of release rates by race. I can try. I don't think I'm going to be able to give good intuition for why on the fly, but in the main analysis, we don't use that information. We are fully agnostic as to, you know, some judge can be really lenient for black defendants and really strict for white defendants. That is fine in our analysis.
I'm sorry, we don't have the picture up to see it.
I can probably put
But all the way on the hand side.
Yeah.
The very first two data points with like, I don't know, a hanging judge who never lets anybody out.
these things.
With the reverse on the bottom.
Yeah. Yeah, I think these are noise, frankly. I mean, I think, so we tried to limit to judges who see, you know, a certain number of cases to limit noise, but there's still some judges in our data that only see like 30 defendants or something. So I think some of that is just noise.
I was wondering if you could talk about how your result in the foster care case, you talked about looking at it by high risk and low risk of misconduct. Does that control for differences in how often someone might get into the system at all based on race? Like if there's like racially systemic reasons that what CBS might get called more often on a family of color.
No. So that is a very simple analysis where we just we just look at everyone who has potential for future maltreatment, and we look at the disparity, racial disparity in that group, not conditioning them. So it could have been that the racial disparities we find are driven by indirect factors like the one you were alluding to. Again, when we do the sort of model-based analysis to figure out the drivers, though, we see that it's almost entirely coming from taste-based discrimination, so it doesn't seem to be coming.
When you say model-based, you mean looking at the regressive and looking at the variables?
Sorry, no, so I think of this as kind of model-free in the sense that we're not specifying anything about how judges or investigators
I
are
see.
making decisions. In the papers, in sort of the appendix or second half, we write down a sort of model of judge or caseworker behavior.
Right.
And in that, by estimating that model, we can learn something about the drivers of these, but under the assumption that the model is correct. So that's why it's not that.
So think of that, actually, question I heard, and then a question, maybe bringing back the kind of conversation, actually.
Yeah.
I do not know the standards in economics literature. It's not your reviewer. Yeah, I don't know the standards, but, like so much of kind of, getting into the question you're asking, so around, what's out of scope is about kind of conditioning, right?
Mhm.
Is there a tradition, I guess, of stating clearly what is being conditioned on?
Yes,
Because that can kind of point
yes.
to, I guess I want to say limitations, which is like
No, I think it is
Yeah.
a limitation.
so limitations into other areas
Yeah.
as well.
No, we had to be very clear about that in both papers, sort of like, this measure of discrimination, we are defining necessarily conditions on past decisions, past behavior, kids getting into the system. We're not able to say anything about that. I think econ is actually pretty good at least at the top journals, like getting authors to state that very clearly. I think it's, again, I think both of these papers were more sold on kind of methodological grounds, and so we got maybe a bit more leeway in that. Like, I think if I were to write another paper using these methods in a different setting, I might get more pushback because I'm no longer innovating methodologically. But I think that's kind of how econ thinks about it. It's like, okay, this is a methods paper, so you can like give them some scope for, so to speak, for not nailing that question.
And on that, something I thought that was really interesting about the CPS case was that, you in a way kind of validated the methodology of CPS. I mean, minus the discrimination in there, but, am I right in kind of thinking of it sort of that way, like without kind of going into the specifics of what they actually do when deciding to remove a child from?
Can you say more about how we validate?
Yeah, I'm curious about that.
Yeah, maybe this was a pull back, so maybe I should actually go and read the paper. It's not. But in basically in making the determination of like, oh, actually they're under, what's the word?
Underplacing.
Underplacing.
Yeah.
That. Maybe actually now I'm thinking that this is not actually how bias works, so you don't actually have perfect ground truth to know.
Right.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
that's what's missing here.
I think that's fair. I don't, in all of our analysis, we're not really taking a stand on what the right decision is.
Right,
I think to do that, you would need to really know what the societal costs of maltreatment are versus family separation, and maybe those vary by race. And so we try and stay away from that. What we do to validate it, kind of in line with this figure for the available setting, is at least by looking at sort of the slope of this line, or showing that in this case, judges are kind of making reasonably good decisions, like they are targeting their mandate, at least on average. And we see the same pattern in the CPS. I don't have the graph here, but it's the same sort of slope that tells us that both investigators and screeners seem to be acting on some reliable signal of future maltreatment potential, which is basically saying that they're at least doing their job somewhat.
But to my eye, that slope is very.
Yeah, so that's the question of how steep should
Right,
that
it's
slope
not,
be?
I mean, you're saying the
Yeah.
sensitivity, but it doesn't seem like a lot of
So
sensitivity.
what we can do is we can benchmark this to an algorithm, so we can like take a, sophisticated machine learning, whatever, and try and predict.
Sorry, I'm
No,
laughing.
I just don't know the terminology as well, but we could take some.
Yes, we always call them sophisticated, yeah.
Sophisticated, fancy algorithm and, produce this kind of line for those algorithms as opposed to judges. And I forget offhand whether the slope is higher or lower, but I think it's pretty similar actually, so.
Good question.
I guess, I'm way out of my field here, but,
No,
like,
that,
looking at-
that's okay. No,
Oh
seriously.
my.
like, looking at these linear fits and,
Yeah.
thinking about some of those, maybe those outlying points and, noticing that you have so much like great variation here, I mean, the variation in your data here, I'm wondering if there's any, if there's a tradition of using Bayesian analyses in
Yeah.
in econometrics to get sort of at least a distribution over this slope parameter,
Absolutely.
or
Yeah.
being able to incorporate a lot of sort of external data into your priors to help with, it's got all these conditioning problems.
So there is absolutely a sort of subfield of econometrics that uses Bayesian methods. I would say that the vast majority of econometrics are frequentists, but there's been a recent push to bring in kind of empirical Bayes methods, so the hybrid there. And we actually,
Can I ask how you identify yourself?
I am pretty much a frequentist, but I do a lot of work with EB, with empirical Bayes. In this project, we did actually do a little bit of that in the sense of adjusting for noise in the sample using kind of empirical Bayes shrinkage methods. Yeah, I think you could do that. And in some sense, the model that we use in the second half of the paper is in that spirit. It's not Bayesian, but it's sort of bringing in our assumptions about how judges are making their decisions, and that gives us more identifying power. But you certainly could do that here if you were simplified.
Question back here.
Yeah, as a very general question about your choice of only looking at black and white races, is that because the data provided only has those two races, or because there's not enough data about?
No, that is like the sort of central distinction in the literature when people talk about racial discrimination in pretrial or in foster care. It tends to concentrate on thinking about black-white disparities. Of course, that's not all of the literature, but that's like the vast majority, and that's where we started. Also, in practice, most of the defendants are labeled as either black or white, but we do have other races in the data. We have looked at Hispanic versus non-Hispanic. Of course, those are overlapping in our data, and we find similar patterns actually. But yeah, it's the kind of thing where we focus on black-white because that's kind of from a policy perspective the thing that is mostly talked about.
You've shown at the end of the placement study, national graph.
Yeah.
Which showed state by state variation.
Yep.
And I wonder if you could gloss that for us and how you would go about taking into account, state level laws as opposed, because many of these laws aren't federal. Or whether you could just tell us what you want us to take home.
Right. So our understanding is that at least in most, if not all states in the United States, the sort of mandate of investigators in CPS is to remove kids from home when the potential for future maltreatment is high. The laws specifically about that may vary. And so we just took that as our discrimination measure and applied it to all of these states. And the takeaways that I would take from this are, first of all, Michigan seems to be kind of representative in the sense that it's kind of in the middle. Some states have higher discrimination, some have lower, but Michigan is kind of average. And so that was kind of a external validity or generalizability check of our Michigan focused study. that was one thing we wanted to look at. The other is just the heterogeneity. So I was pretty surprised to see that these southern states had lower discrimination than say these more western states, including California. I don't know what is driving that variation. We tried to do a little bit of, you know, correlational analysis here to see what predicts that statewide variation, but I would say it's pretty inconclusive. Of course, the correlations are suggestive. They're not, you know, indicative of anything in particular, but we did find that, you know, states with a lower share of Black tend to have higher discrimination for some reason. So I think there's more work to be done here. This is still kind of a work in progress,
I mean,
but
do you also control for things like resources available to CPS in different states? How
we do in,
seniors per
yeah,
population
yeah.
segment, right?
we have some measures that not here in this slide deck, but in the revision of the paper, but that I forget what we find there, but that's something we could look at as well. So I would say what we take away from this is that there is a lot of variation. We don't necessarily understand it that well. And so, you know, that's potentially something for future work.
So 4 o'clock, and I want to thank Peter. Of course, you're welcome to stay behind.
Yeah, happy to
You can
answer more
ask
questions
but
offline.
as long as you're available.
Yeah, of course,
But I
of
want
course.
to make sure everyone who needs to leave can leave, and thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you all for. Yeah, thank you. That's fun.
Some of the, yes, literature on CPS stuff, like.
A little bit. A little bit, yeah, especially talking to Allegheny to try and do some version of this there, some experimentation there.
Okay.
And through that have talked with Alex and the other folks. We've been sort of dancing around the idea of collaboration, but it's like not always clear.
Yeah.
Like
So they have their
incentives and things.
partners already.
They have
They
things
work
already
closely
set.
with the Auckland.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly, exactly. It's very interesting stuff what they
Yeah.
do. But,
Cool.
yeah. Thanks,
Yeah.
Ash. Hey,
Maybe there.
hi.
I was wondering, think there might be like when you like in the graph where you have black versus white release rate.
Yeah.
Or future misconduct potential.
Yeah.
Can there be differences in the, like I think it's related to a question that was asked. Can there be difference in the proportion of individuals that are released by its judge and whether that can change the,
So the x-axis is the proportion of people released by each judge.
but can be differences when you move across judges in the proportion of white versus
Yes,
black? That-
yes.
Can you use maybe, since that you can get from the data, can you use
Yeah.
that to make a more accurate?
So yeah, not in the sort of first pass, we don't sort of use that variation at all. In the model where we make some assumptions about how judges make decisions, the within judge correlation in release rates tells us something about that process. So we do use that in the sort of second half of the paper, but not the first. Yeah, of course. Thanks. Yeah.
So,
Hey, nice to meet you.
so, like in your first paper, do you find any kind of like heterogeneity by if the person is accused? So let's say, imagine if a black person is accused of committing a crime against a white person vis-a-vis
We
committing.
don't look at that. I'm not sure we can because we see the charges. So we see if someone is like accused of theft or felony or whatever, but we don't see the person, the victim. We don't see the identified victim. I think that would be pretty interesting.
I'll go and read the paper.
Yeah,
I'm a new visiting PhD student here. I'm
Okay.
working with Andrew Foster.
Oh, cool. All right, word. Yeah. What sort of things do you work on?
I work on discrimination, but in the Indian context. So how does politics impact provision of public goods? That's what I'm
Very good.
looking at.
Are you around all year or
I'm here till end of August.
end of August? Okay, cool.
We have talked a bit before, when you did that seminar on systemic discrimination at Bahujani Congress. But
Okay,
that was very brief and online. so-
Sorry, yeah, I know, okay.
yeah,
Yeah,
but
that
that
makes
paper,
sense,
yeah.
that makes sense. Yeah, well, maybe we can find more opportunities to chat.
Sure.
Yeah.
See you around.
Cool, see you around, thank you. That was next.
I have a quick question about
Sure.
the same plot.
Yeah.
The judge release and the.
Yeah.
And you said the positive slope suggests that the judges are doing a good job.
Yeah.
And I was kind of confused about that because in my mind, this shouldn't still be like 0 or even negative for the judge to do a good job. It's like higher release rates. For judges to have a higher release rate, but the release criminals.
So think about what the judge, the thing we want judges to be doing is ordering people by their pretrial misconduct risk and detaining the people with the highest risk and releasing the people with the lowest risk.
Yeah.
And of course, we don't see variation within a judge. But if you grant that the variation across judges tells us something about that ordering, which is a leap, then you would expect if you look at judges with higher and higher release rates, you would see the actual misconduct rate getting higher and higher because they're starting with the people with very low risk. So if I order people from high to low risk and I release the people with low risk, then as I move up, I'm releasing people with higher and higher risk.
Yeah.
Such that the slope should be positive.
Okay.
That's the idea.
So it's just a natural thing.
Yeah.
It's not suggesting they're doing a good job of that job.
It's just suggesting that they are ordering people, they're doing better than random ordering.
Oh, okay.
They're not like randomly ordering people, they're ordering people at least on some signal of pretrial misconduct potential. Now, we don't know if it's a good signal or a bad signal, we just know that it's positively correlated, the signal that they're using to run.
And if they're randomly ordering people.
It would be flat.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah, no problem.
You probably, I mean, you wanted to explain